The palace stands in silence now. Its walls are weathered, its corridors empty, its grandeur hollowed out by time. Yet there is something about it that unsettles even the most seasoned traveler. The first thing you notice when you step inside is not the decay of stone or the scent of dust, but the absence of something that should be there. Not a single mirror remains. Every reflective surface, once polished to perfection, has been smashed into oblivion. Shards of glass, like frozen tears, still linger in corners where the wind hasn't carried them away. They crunch softly underfoot, a faint reminder of violence long past. Imagine walking through a hall once lined with towering mirrors, gilded frames, surfaces so pristine they seemed like portals to another world. Those mirrors reflected not just faces but moments of history, royal processions, whispered conspiracies, stolen glances between lovers, and the silent grief of betrayals. Today, all that remains are scars on the walls, jagged outlines where mirrors once hung like silent witnesses. The palace is no longer a place of reflection. It is a place of erasure. The question lingers like a ghost: why? Why would a royal family, with all its wealth, status, and obsession with legacy, order the destruction of something so symbolic, so tied to their identity? Mirrors are more than decoration, they are instruments of memory. To remove them is to remove evidence of who you were. To shatter them is to violently deny the truth of what once was. Local folklore offers chilling explanations. Some say the royal family was cursed, that mirrors revealed too much, distortions of faces, flickers of death before it came, glimpses of futures no one wanted to see. Others whisper it was punishment, that the family had committed sins so grave, they could no longer bear their own reflections. Then there are the skeptics, the historians who argue that the mirrors were smashed in a fit of paranoia, perhaps to conceal deformities, madness, or even murder. None of these theories feel complete, and that incompleteness is precisely what makes the palace so haunting. Visitors often describe a strange sensation upon entering. They feel watched, even though the walls are bare. They feel fragmented, as if their own identity struggles to hold together inside the ruins. Some insist they still hear the echoes of glass shattering at night, the sound reverberating through corridors that should be silent. There are those who claim that if you carry a mirror into the palace, it won't survive until morning, it will crack on its own, no matter how carefully you guard it. But what really happened here? What moment of terror, despair, or madness drove the destruction of every reflection? The story begins not with dust and ruin, but with wealth, glory, and a dynasty that believed it would last forever. A dynasty whose downfall is written in shards of glass. The royal family who lived here were admired and envied in equal measure. They dined in candlelit halls where mirrors doubled the brilliance of the flames. They dressed in silks and jewels, admiring themselves in golden frames, as if confirming their place above all others. Mirrors were not mere ornaments to them, they were affirmations of power, instruments of vanity, symbols of divine right. To look upon one's reflection in such a palace was to be reminded of both beauty and authority. And yet, it was within those very reflections that the seeds of destruction began to grow. Legends say the first mirror to be broken was not destroyed by decree, but by desperation. A scream echoed through the palace one night, followed by the sound of glass shattering. Servants whispered of a king who saw something in the mirror that should not have been there. Some said it was his own face, aged and decayed as if death had already claimed him. Others claimed he saw blood dripping across his crown, though none was truly there. Whatever it was, it frightened him so deeply that he ordered the mirror destroyed on the spot. That moment, perhaps, was the beginning of an unraveling, one act of violence against reflection that would eventually spread like contagion through the palace halls. Still, questions remain. Was the smashing of the mirrors a symbolic act of protection, a desperate attempt to erase something too terrible to confront? Or was it an invitation to something darker, an act that, once begun, could not be undone? As we step deeper into this story, we will peel back layers of legend and history, tracing the family's path from splendor to ruin. The Palace of Shattered Mirrors does not simply hold a mystery, it embodies one. And as you'll see, the destruction of every mirror was not the end of their story. It was only the beginning. The palace did not begin as a place of silence. In its earliest days, it was a marvel of ambition and vision, a beacon of wealth and artistry, standing as proof of a dynasty's unshakable grip on power. Travelers wrote of its luminous halls, of courtyards so vast they seemed to contain the sky itself, of banquet chambers where golden chandeliers glittered against rows of mirrors that multiplied their light into infinity. When torches flickered along the walls, it was said the palace seemed alive, a living organism of flame and reflection, breathing grandeur into all who entered. Every corridor told a story. Murals depicted victories in battle, mythical beasts vanquished, and ancestors immortalized as heroes. Marble pillars rose like frozen trees, their polished surfaces catching slivers of the world around them. And everywhere, always, everywhere, were mirrors. Their frames were carved with meticulous detail, angels, demons, vines twisting into serpents, crowns entwined with roses. Each mirror was not simply an object, it was a witness, an archive of every gesture, every secret meeting, every silent betrayal. To the royal family, the mirrors were more than decoration. They were symbols of eternal surveillance, a reminder that the dynasty's glory was not just to be seen but to be endlessly reflected. Guests at the palace often reported feeling unnerved, as though their every movement was observed 100 times over. A simple glance at one's reflection carried weight. To look into those mirrors was to see yourself, yes, but also to be reminded of the monarchy's presence, its omnipotence, its shadow pressing down upon you. The family itself was a paradox. On the surface, they were admired, a king with a commanding presence, a queen celebrated for her beauty and cunning intelligence, heirs groomed to represent continuity and stability. Their portraits, preserved in faded tapestries and rare surviving sketches, still reveal a striking elegance. But behind the sheen of grandeur, cracks were forming, cracks hidden, at first, by the glitter of wealth and the cold perfection of mirrors. The king was said to be charismatic but deeply suspicious. His reign was marked by splendor, yet his private chambers were filled with records of betrayals both real and imagined. He demanded loyalty, yet rarely trusted those closest to him. The queen, though admired by the people, carried whispers around her, whispers of secret lovers, of alliances made in shadows, of a woman who smiled as easily as she lied. Their children grew up surrounded by both affection and tension, forced to play roles larger than themselves, taught to smile before mirrors that reflected not innocence but expectation. There is a tale of the youngest daughter, who at only 12 years old, stood in front of a gilded mirror longer than anyone could explain. She was found whispering to her own reflection, asking questions, nodding as though she heard answers. When the king discovered her, he struck the mirror in fury, cracking it from end to end. Though it was quickly replaced, the servants never forgot the child's haunted eyes, or how she never quite spoke the same again. Even in its prime, the palace was not free of unease. Visitors, scribes, and foreign dignitaries left cryptic notes in their travelogues. Some remarked on how the mirrors sometimes seemed to ripple, as though the reflections lagged behind reality by a fraction of a second. Others described catching glimpses of people who were not present, a face in the crowd that vanished when looked at directly, a shadow that did not match the person casting it. Skeptics dismissed these as tricks of candlelight and imagination, yet the rumors persisted. The destruction of the mirrors did not happen overnight, but the palace had always been more than stone and glass. It was a vessel for human ambition, pride, and fear. To understand why every mirror was smashed, we must understand how the palace itself became a prison of perception. The royal family began to avoid certain halls, claiming the mirrors there gave them headaches or visions. Banquets grew fewer. Courtiers whispered that the king forbade anyone to linger too long before a mirror, as though fearing what truths might be revealed. And yet, there were contradictions. Public ceremonies continued, the palace still radiating opulence for those outside the family's inner circle. To the world, the dynasty remained untouchable. Behind closed doors, however, something was unraveling. The palace's shadows grew longer, not only with the passage of time but with the weight of secrets left unspoken. Historians argue over whether the palace's decline was caused by external threats, political enemies, rival dynasties, or economic collapse, or whether it was an implosion from within, a corrosion of trust that no wealth could disguise. What is undeniable is that the destruction of the mirrors, when it came, was not an isolated act but the climax of years of growing tension. The Palace of Brilliance had already become a palace of shadows, long before the first shard of glass fell to the floor. Today, when you stand in the ruins, the absence of mirrors feels deliberate, as though the walls themselves refuse to carry memory. Where once reflections danced, there is only blankness, a void that seems to swallow you whole. You cannot help but wonder if this was the family's intention all along, to leave behind nothing of themselves but silence. And yet, as we continue deeper into this story, the silence is deceptive. For beneath the glamour and ruin lies something far darker, a belief in a curse, whispered across generations, a curse that promised to turn every reflection into a prophecy of doom. And it is there, within that curse, that the first cracks of their fate will truly be revealed. Curses are rarely written in stone, yet they linger in whispers, in folklore, and in the small superstitions that outlast empires. For the royal family who called the mirror-lined palace their home, a curse was not just a story told to frighten children, it was a shadow entwined with their bloodline. The origins of this curse are hazy, contested between myth and half-forgotten records. Some say it began centuries before the palace itself was built, with an ancestor who betrayed a seer. According to local legend, the king's forebear sought guidance from a mystic woman renowned for her visions. She warned him of arrogance, of the danger of confusing reflection with reality. But instead of heeding her, he mocked her, accusing her of witchcraft and condemning her to die. Before her execution, she is said to have cursed his descendants, "Your line will be haunted by the truth in glass. Your reflections will show not what you are, but what you fear most. And when the mirrors are gone, so too will your name vanish." Historians, of course, remain skeptical. They argue the so-called curse was a retroactive invention, a way for people to explain the strange behavior of the dynasty generations later. Yet, whether the curse was real or not, belief in it shaped decisions, rituals, and ultimately, destinies. From the earliest recorded generations, the family's relationship with mirrors was troubled. One king, decades before the Palace of Mirrors was even conceived, was said to cover every reflective surface in his chambers with cloth at night, claiming he heard whispers when he tried to sleep. His queen, in contrast, surrounded herself with polished bronze and crystal, convinced that mirrors brought prosperity and beauty. Their conflicting obsessions filtered down to their children, creating a household split between those who feared reflection and those who adored it. By the time the mirror-filled palace was constructed, the family had reached its zenith. Wealth poured in from trade and conquest, and the dynasty commissioned architects, artisans, and glassmakers to build a residence that would outshine every rival court. It was not merely a palace, it was a statement to the world. The mirrors that lined the halls were both decoration and declaration. This was a dynasty unafraid to face itself, unafraid to multiply its image infinitely. But for those who believed in the curse, the palace was also a trap, a gilded cage reflecting their doom from every angle. The curse took on a more sinister life with personal anecdotes that began to circulate in court. Servants whispered that the king's reflection often lagged a moment behind his real movements, as though the mirror knew something he did not. A chambermaid claimed she once saw the queen's face streaked with tears in a mirror, even though she was smiling in reality. One heir, a boy of 13, became obsessed with his reflection, convinced it would show him the face of the bride he was destined to marry. When he saw only his own eyes staring back at him, hollow and strange, he became withdrawn, refusing to eat until he eventually fell into a fever that carried him to an early grave. It was after this boy's death that the talk of the curse could no longer be dismissed. The queen herself began to visit priests, astrologers, even foreign mystics who claimed to lift curses. Yet none succeeded. Instead, the mirrors seemed to grow heavier with meaning. Courtiers stopped lingering before them, even guests grew uneasy. A banquet that should have been a dazzling affair of candlelight and laughter was instead remembered for its silence, as diners kept their eyes lowered, too afraid to meet their own gaze multiplied across dozens of reflective walls. The curse also crept into politics. Rivals used it as a weapon, spreading rumors that the dynasty was unraveling under supernatural affliction. Pamphlets smuggled into towns depicted the royal family as grotesque figures, their reflections twisted, their souls corrupted. The people began to see the dynasty less as divinely ordained rulers and more as a bloodline haunted by its own arrogance. Yet inside the palace, the family clung to rituals meant to control the curse. Before important decisions, the king would stand before his largest mirror, staring at his reflection for hours, waiting for signs, a flicker, a distortion, any indication of what the future held. The queen developed her own practice. Before dawn, she would shatter a small piece of glass in her chambers, whispering prayers over the shards, as if scattering evil before the day began. These actions brought temporary comfort, but they also deepened the family's obsession, making every glance in a mirror an act of divination rather than simple vanity. The most chilling accounts, however, come from the younger generation. Letters preserved in private collections speak of children who could not distinguish between themselves and their reflections. One daughter wrote that she often saw her reflection smiling when she was not, or blinking when her eyes remained open. Another son confessed in a diary that he dreamed of being pulled into the mirror and waking on the other side, unable to return. These writings were dismissed by official historians as childish fancies, but taken together, they reveal a family suffocating under the weight of belief, or perhaps reality, that something unnatural lingered within their mirrors. One night stands out as a turning point. A violent storm lashed the palace, and lightning struck so close that windows shattered. In the chaos, a servant reported hearing the king shouting at his reflection, his voice echoing down the halls. "You will not take me," he screamed, before striking the mirror with his sword, splitting it into fragments. When the storm passed, the palace was filled with a tension that never fully lifted. From that night onward, the smashing of mirrors became less of an accident and more of a ritual, repeated whenever fear overtook reason. Whether or not the curse was real is almost beside the point. What mattered is that the royal family believed in it, and that belief guided their choices. A family that once thrived on strength and unity became consumed by paranoia, by the terror of what their own reflections might reveal. The curse, in this sense, did not simply haunt them, it defined them. And as time passed, the line between superstition and reality blurred until even historians could not disentangle one from the other. Were the mirrors truly cursed, or did the family's fear of the curse make it real? Did their obsession manifest madness, or did madness feed the legend? These questions linger like smoke, impossible to grasp fully. But one thing is clear, by the time the last generation of this dynasty walked the palace halls, the curse was no longer a whispered rumor. It was a force woven into their very lives, pushing them toward the night when every mirror in the palace would be smashed, a night that would seal their fate forever. If the palace was a stage, then the court was its performance, a theater of loyalty, rivalry, and masks. Every day, ministers, generals, scholars, and courtiers filled the audience chambers with their carefully chosen words and rehearsed gestures. Yet behind the glittering ceremonies, whispers slithered like smoke through hidden corridors. The palace walls, they said, had ears. And the mirrors, before they were broken, had eyes. It was here that the true power of rumor began to eat at the dynasty. Servants, who drifted silently between feasts and strategy meetings, carried stories like pollen from one chamber to another. They whispered of mirrors that did not show the same reflection twice, of guests who paled after glancing into polished glass, of heirs seen speaking to their reflections as if to a confidant. The courtiers repeated these tales, half in mockery, half in fear, until the palace itself seemed thick with superstition. Political intrigue only magnified the tension. Ministers debated foreign alliances, military campaigns, and tax reforms, but their words were often sharpened by rivalry. A smile at court rarely meant sincerity, it was usually a mask for calculation. Everyone sought the king's approval, but few trusted his volatile temper. He was known to watch his advisers through the great hall's mirrors, claiming he could see their true intentions reflected in the glass. It was said he once dismissed an ambassador on the spot because, according to the king, his reflection bowed half a second too late. The queen, more subtle, ruled her circle with charm and manipulation. Her gatherings in the smaller salons were legendary, wine flowing, music echoing, and yet beneath the gaiety lay a current of whispered alliances. Foreign visitors were dazzled by her grace, but insiders noticed how she always chose to sit with her back to the largest mirror, never allowing her own image to dominate the room. Some called it clever stagecraft, others wondered if she, too, feared what the mirror might reveal when her guard was down. The servants' gossip turned darker after a peculiar incident involving one of the royal children. The youngest daughter, known for her quiet and dreamy temperament, wandered into a gallery late one evening. A guard found her standing before a mirror, wide-eyed, her lips trembling as she whispered, "She's in there, she's calling me." When asked who she meant, the child burst into tears and refused to speak for days. Nurses claimed she refused to sleep in any room where mirrors remained uncovered. For the court, this was proof that the so-called curse was no longer confined to the imaginations of paranoid adults, it was seeping into the minds of innocents. Documents from that era record another chilling story. During a lavish banquet, as musicians played and courtiers clapped in rhythm, one nobleman suddenly gasped, clutching his chest. He claimed that in the mirror before him, he had seen his reflection turn away and walk out of the glass entirely, leaving the seat empty. He collapsed moments later, dead of what physicians described as an apoplexy. But the rumor that spread was simpler: the mirror had stolen his soul. Court diaries, though carefully censored, contain telling omissions. Pages are torn, passages inked over. Yet what survives hints at a spreading unease. Advisors urged the king to remove the mirrors from council chambers, fearing they distracted from policy discussions. Priests recommended daily rituals of cleansing, incense, holy water, prayers, to drive away evil forces. But just as many voices insisted the mirrors must remain, arguing that to destroy them would dishonor the family's legacy and invite worse misfortune. In this tug-of-war, paranoia festered. The court's instability was not lost on foreign powers. Envoys sent letters home remarking that the dynasty seemed both dazzling and fragile. One Italian ambassador described the palace as a kingdom within a looking glass, beautiful, but one strike away from breaking. Rival dynasties, eager to exploit weakness, began whispering that the royal family had lost the mandate of heaven. Meanwhile, ordinary servants developed their own coping rituals. Some avoided looking into mirrors altogether, bowing their heads when passing them in corridors. Others whispered protective prayers under their breath when polishing glass, as though trying to wipe away not only dust but unseen shadows. A few, more daring, scratched symbols onto the backs of mirror frames, crude charms meant to trap whatever malevolence lurked within. The claustrophobia of the court grew worse when letters from exiled nobles surfaced. These men and women, once loyal to the crown, now spread tales that the dynasty hid dark crimes behind their obsession with mirrors. They accused the family of using them in occult rituals, of summoning visions of enemies to curse, of speaking with the dead through reflective surfaces. While such accusations were exaggerated, they inflamed suspicion among those already on edge. The greatest danger, however, came not from outside enemies but from within the palace itself. Rivalries among siblings intensified, with each heir convinced that the others were conspiring. Letters between princes reveal growing mistrust, each one reading treachery into harmless gestures. "I saw his eyes in the glass," one prince wrote, "and they did not match the smile on his lips." Another recorded a nightmare in which he struck at his brother, only to see his own face break apart in shards of glass. The mirrors became tools of paranoia. The king demanded that important council sessions be held in chambers lined with them, declaring that a liar cannot survive under 100 reflections. Predictably, this only made courtiers more nervous, every twitch and hesitation magnified until accusations flew freely. To be caught glancing too long at one's reflection could be interpreted as guilt. To avoid the mirrors entirely was considered suspicious. It was a court where even breathing wrong might condemn you. By this stage, the whispers were no longer confined to gossip. They were shaping decisions of state, eroding alliances, and sowing divisions within the royal family itself. The palace was still outwardly magnificent, but the heart of power had become fragile, brittle as the glass it was built upon. And then came the night that solidified the dynasty's dread. A young prince, restless and defiant, confronted his father in the great hall. Accounts differ, but many agree on this detail: the boy struck a mirror in anger, shattering it from top to bottom. The sound echoed through the court, and in that silence that followed, every courtier held their breath. The king's face turned pale, the queen buried her mouth in her hands, and the courtiers whispered the words no dynasty wants to hear: the curse has chosen its next victim. From that night on, fear was no longer an undercurrent. It was the ruling force of the court. Every glance, every whisper, every fractured reflection became another omen. And though no one could say for certain what awaited them, they knew the palace was drifting toward catastrophe. The night began like any other in the palace, yet nothing about it would remain ordinary. Outside, a storm brewed over the city, lightning splitting the sky and rain pounding against the palace roofs. Inside, torches flickered along the corridors, casting elongated shadows that danced across walls once lined with gleaming mirrors. The halls were empty, save for servants scurrying to secure doors and windows against the coming storm. But the palace was already unsettled, tension hung heavier than the storm itself, a prelude to the chaos that would erupt before the night ended. It started in the eastern gallery, a room of mirrors that had always been the pride of the dynasty. They were enormous, reaching from floor to ceiling, gilded frames glinting under torchlight, each reflecting hundreds of other reflections in dizzying multiplicity. According to surviving accounts, it was the youngest daughter who first approached the mirrors that evening. She had been wandering, unable to sleep, drawn inexplicably to the glass. Servants would later recount her whispering, "They're all watching, all of them. I cannot face them." And then, the first crack appeared. A mirror, impossibly large and heavy, split down the middle with a sound like a thunderclap. The girl screamed, a sharp, piercing sound that echoed off the walls. The servants rushed in, but it was already too late. The breaking of that single mirror seemed to ignite something inside the palace itself. Within moments, another mirror shattered, then another, cascading like falling dominoes. The sound was deafening, glass crunching underfoot, shards scattering like silver snow. Lightning flashed through the windows, illuminating faces twisted in fear and disbelief. The royal family was drawn to the scene. The king arrived first, sword in hand, his eyes wild as he surveyed the destruction. "Stop it," he bellowed. "Who dares destroy my mirrors?" But the voices he heard were not human. They were whispers carried from one hall to another, the sound of glass cracking resonating in ways that made it seem alive. The queen appeared, her face pale beneath the candlelight, clutching a crucifix she barely seemed to notice. Behind them, the heirs stared into the shattered reflections, their own images multiplied and fragmented, flickering like spirits trapped in the broken glass. What happened next remains a matter of speculation, even centuries later. Some historians claim the destruction was deliberate, an act ordered by the king in a fit of paranoia, striking down mirrors one after another to erase something he feared might be revealed. Others insist it was hysteria, that the family's obsession with reflection, combined with the storm and rumors of the curse, drove them to collective madness. Witness accounts differ. One servant swore she saw the queen shatter a mirror with her bare hands, while another claimed the youngest prince hurled himself against a gilded frame, smashing it into splinters. Yet it was not only the royal family. Courtiers and servants alike became participants in the chaos. Some sought to flee, only to slip on the shards and collapse in panic. Others tried to intervene, attempting to cover mirrors or gather pieces, but were swept aside by the unstoppable force of the frenzy. The palace, so often a place of order and ceremony, was transformed into a theater of terror. Lightning flashed again, striking a distant turret, and for a moment the hall was illuminated in a blinding white light. Shadows stretched across walls, merging with broken glass to create grotesque, flickering figures that seemed almost alive. The sound of shattering glass, once startling, became a rhythm, a terrifying, maddening beat that guided the night. Some historians note that the event lasted hours, not minutes, a slow-motion destruction that left no surface untouched. Mirrors in bedrooms, galleries, dining halls, and council chambers all succumbed to the mania. By dawn, only fragments remained, jagged, sharp reminders of what had been, reflecting nothing but broken light. In the chaos, small tragedies occurred that would haunt the dynasty forever. A young prince, attempting to save a fallen mirror, was struck by a falling shard and badly injured. Servants were cut, some gravely, as they tried to escape the madness. One noble woman, trapped in a corridor, reportedly clutched the remnants of her reflection and wept, screaming that the mirrors were trying to tell her the family's sins aloud. Others spoke in hushed, terrified tones of whispers in the glass, voices of ancestors, perhaps, or mere hallucinations induced by fear and exhaustion. The psychological impact on the family was immediate and profound. The king, once commanding and decisive, was found hours later wandering aimlessly among the shards, muttering incoherently about shadows and reflections that had turned against him. The queen, normally composed and politically astute, was discovered in the eastern gallery, weeping quietly before a pile of shattered fragments, as if mourning not just the mirrors but the reality they had once reflected. The heirs, shaken and traumatized, would later record in diaries their sense of unreality, that the night had dissolved the boundaries between self and reflection, between truth and superstition. Some scholars argue that this night marked the irreversible decline of the dynasty. Before, the family had been troubled by rumor, superstition, and paranoia. Afterward, they were consumed by them. Mirrors no longer offered vanity or surveillance, they were instruments of terror, reminders of guilt and fear. The palace itself seemed to shift, the empty frames and jagged shards acting as conduits for a lingering unease, an echo of the night when every reflective surface turned against its owner. Even centuries later, visitors describe a palpable atmosphere of dread in the ruins. Though the mirrors are gone, the legacy of that night lingers, an invisible weight of history pressing down upon anyone who steps into the halls. Scholars note that the smashing of the mirrors was not merely physical destruction, it was symbolic. The family sought to eradicate reflection, but in doing so, they could not escape the truth of their own fears. Their obsession, superstition, and paranoia became self-fulfilling, destroying the very symbols of their power. The night of shattered glass is remembered not only for the sound, the chaos, and the broken mirrors, but for the sense that the dynasty itself was shattered along with them. A family that had once stood above all others, reflecting glory and authority, now faced a hollow palace and a fractured legacy. And yet, the story does not end here. Because in the ruins, in the whispers, and in the memories passed down through generations, the mirrors were never truly gone. They lingered in the fragments, in the fear they instilled, and in the minds of a family who could no longer distinguish themselves from the reflections they had destroyed. The palace, now a monument to obsession and terror, stands as a warning, that the fear of what we might see in ourselves can be more destructive than any external enemy. And as the sun rose over the city, illuminating shards of glass like cruel diamonds in the halls, the royal family emerged from the night irrevocably changed. They had survived, yes, but the palace, and the curse that had haunted their reflections, had left its mark forever. A question remained, one that would haunt historians and descendants alike: had they smashed the mirrors to destroy the curse, or had the curse smashed them? When dawn broke after the night of shattered glass, the palace was unrecognizable. What had once been a symbol of brilliance now resembled a battlefield. Shattered mirrors littered the floors like jagged snow, each fragment reflecting a distorted and incomplete version of reality. The halls, once echoing with music, laughter, and ceremony, were now suffused with silence, broken only by the occasional sob or groan of an injured servant. But it was not merely the palace that had been transformed, the royal family itself had begun a descent that would be as complete and irrevocable as the mirrors lying in shards at their feet. The king, whose very presence once inspired awe and obedience, emerged a changed man. He wandered through the halls in a trance-like state, muttering to himself and gesturing at empty walls as if accusing them of treachery. Advisors who attempted to approach him were met with sudden anger, sharp accusations of betrayal, and fits of paranoia. He became obsessed with rebuilding the mirrors, not for vanity or pride, but out of a desperate need to restore the reality he believed had been stolen from him. When craftsmen attempted to craft replacements, the king destroyed them himself, convinced that no new glass could capture the true essence of the family's reflection. The queen fared no better. Known for her poise and cunning, she had once commanded court politics with subtlety, bending allies and rivals alike to her will. Now, she was consumed by guilt and fear. Diaries and letters from the period describe her wandering the empty galleries at all hours, clutching shards of glass to her chest as though they were talismans. She whispered apologies to reflections that no longer existed, mourning the family she felt she had failed. Her health declined rapidly, and her once commanding voice was reduced to a trembling murmur, barely audible over the wind that rattled the palace windows. The heirs, too, were transformed by the night. Some withdrew entirely, avoiding contact with even their closest relatives. One prince refused to enter any room where glass remained, claiming he could still see faces in the shards, faces accusing him of unspoken crimes. Another daughter, haunted by visions she could not explain, began speaking to herself, convinced that the palace itself had a consciousness, one that recorded every thought, every action, and now demanded penance. Their behavior destabilized the court further, as ministers and advisors became unsure whether decisions were being made by rational actors or by those unmoored by fear and superstition. The servants and courtiers, too, struggled to navigate this new reality. Some fled in fear, unable to endure the oppressive atmosphere. Others remained, but only out of necessity or duty, their loyalty tested by the growing instability. Those who stayed became silent observers, witnesses to the unraveling of a family that had once seemed indomitable. The palace, in their eyes, had transformed into a living entity, one that reflected not glory but terror. Political alliances, once the backbone of the dynasty's strength, began to crumble. Foreign powers, long wary of the family's influence, seized on signs of weakness. Ambassadors and envoys reported that the royal court had become unpredictable, decisions made by whim or fear rather than strategy. Treaties were delayed, negotiations faltered, and rivals grew emboldened, sensing that the dynasty was no longer in control of its own destiny. Even within the kingdom, nobles began whispering of succession crises, exploiting the paranoia that had gripped the family to advance their own positions. In private, historians note, the family attempted various remedies to stave off the decline. Some rituals were introduced to counter the perceived curse, priests were brought in, ceremonies conducted, and protective charms scattered throughout the palace. Yet these acts, meant to restore order, often only reinforced the family's obsession with mirrors and reflection. Every failed ritual was interpreted as proof of the curse's potency, every minor misfortune was seen as evidence that the family's fate was irrevocably sealed. Isolation became a defining feature of life after the night of shattering. The family withdrew from public appearances, conducting fewer court sessions and avoiding audiences with visiting dignitaries. Children were kept within private quarters, their education conducted under strict supervision, and only select servants allowed near them. The palace, once open and expansive, became a labyrinth of private chambers, locked doors, and guarded corridors. Shadows deepened in every corner, and silence replaced the music and laughter that had once defined the dynasty. Psychological strain manifested in other, more disturbing ways. Some accounts describe compulsive behaviors, the king counting shards of glass, the queen arranging fragments in patterns she believed would ward off evil, heirs obsessively staring at the few remaining reflective surfaces. Dreams of mirrors haunted them, with images of faces that were not their own, or reflections that moved independently. Some believed the palace itself had absorbed a consciousness, that the shattered glass carried a fragment of the curse, whispering reminders of every fear, every misdeed, every betrayal. Over time, this internal collapse had tangible consequences. Governance weakened, justice faltered, and civil unrest began to ripple through the kingdom. Nobles and citizens alike interpreted the family's withdrawal and erratic behavior as evidence that the curse, or madness, had overtaken the monarchy. Rumors spread like wildfire, fueling both fear and resentment. The dynasty's enemies, once kept at bay by a combination of power and diplomacy, sensed opportunity, and small skirmishes at the borders became more frequent. Yet despite all this, the family clung desperately to the remnants of their former power. Every act, every command, was driven by a desire to restore what had been lost. Mirrors were replaced with polished metal, then removed again. Ceremonies attempted to mimic former grandeur, but they lacked the vibrancy and authority of the past. The palace, a once glorious reflection of stability, had become a theater of obsession, grief, and fear. And so, life continued in a peculiar and haunting rhythm. Days were measured by shadows rather than sunlight, and the family's interactions were dominated by suspicion, fear, and ritual. The very architecture of the palace seemed to enforce isolation. Corridors were long and echoing, rooms were partitioned and locked, and every corner was a potential trap for a wandering eye. The mirrors, though broken, had left an imprint that could not be erased, not on the walls, not on the floors, and certainly not on the minds of those who remained. By the end of the decade, the palace was no longer a seat of power but a monument to obsession. The family that had once ruled with authority now existed in a fragile equilibrium of fear and superstition. The decline was no longer gradual, it had become absolute. And yet, history would remember them not only for the tragedy that followed the night of shattered glass but for the haunting sense that their downfall was a slow-motion replay of choices, fears, and obsessions that had been centuries in the making. In essence, the aftermath of that night was not just the destruction of mirrors. It was the collapse of a dynasty's very identity. The royal family, once proud and commanding, became prisoners of reflection, of what they feared, what they believed, and what they could no longer face. And in the silence of the halls, among the shards and shadows, one question remained: could a family ever recover from a night when its very reality had been shattered? For centuries, the story of the palace with shattered mirrors has fascinated scholars, historians, and conspiracy theorists alike. The royal family's descent, the violent destruction of reflective surfaces, and the psychological unraveling of those within have been examined, debated, and reimagined countless times. Yet despite extensive research, the truth remains elusive, hidden somewhere between history, rumor, and legend. Early chroniclers tried to record the events in real time. Letters, diaries, and official records speak of an extraordinary night when mirrors shattered across the palace. These documents, though often incomplete or biased, provide glimpses into the chaos that engulfed the royal family. Some chronicles suggest that the family's obsession with mirrors had been known for decades, with previous generations displaying similar behaviors: paranoia, compulsive rituals, and fear of their own reflections. These early accounts fueled the first theories, that the destruction was the result of a supernatural curse. The curse theory, still popular among folklore enthusiasts, holds that the royal family was doomed by the wrath of a spurned seer centuries earlier. According to these stories, the seer's curse targeted not only the family's longevity but their ability to perceive themselves accurately. The shattered mirrors, from this perspective, were not merely objects of vanity destroyed in hysteria but symbols of a deeper, mystical failure. Each fragment of glass was a manifestation of the curse's power, a reflection of the family's doom. Skeptical historians, however, argue that the curse is a convenient narrative device rather than a factual explanation. They point to evidence of political instability, mental illness, and interpersonal conflicts within the family. Royal letters, council records, and servant memoirs reveal mounting tensions among heirs, advisors, and foreign powers. These scholars suggest that the night of shattered glass was less about supernatural forces and more about an accumulation of stress, paranoia, and fear that erupted in uncontrollable violence. One prominent theory focuses on the psychology of the king himself. Experts in historical psychiatry have examined surviving records of his behavior, obsessive rituals, erratic decision-making, and extreme reactions to perceived threats. They argue that the king may have suffered from a severe form of paranoia, possibly exacerbated by isolation, pressure to maintain the dynasty's image, and fear of betrayal. The mirrors, ever present in the palace, became catalysts for his mental deterioration. Reflections that once symbolized power turned into instruments of terror, magnifying his anxieties until the act of smashing them became inevitable. The queen, too, is subject to scrutiny. Letters suggest she was deeply superstitious, consulting mystics and astrologers in the months leading up to the catastrophic night. Some historians propose that her influence contributed to the family's obsession with rituals and fears surrounding mirrors. The combination of the king's paranoia and the queen's mysticism may have created a feedback loop, a psychological pressure cooker in which hysteria was almost inevitable. Another line of investigation examines the role of the court itself. Records indicate that courtiers and advisors often spread rumors, some deliberately, to manipulate the royal family. Rival factions within the court may have intentionally amplified fears, creating the impression that the mirrors were alive with malevolent intent. Historians argue that this courtly manipulation could have accelerated the family's breakdown, turning a psychological crisis into an uncontrollable disaster. Modern researchers have also applied forensic analysis to surviving fragments of the palace's mirrors. Using techniques such as chemical composition analysis, they discovered that some mirrors were crafted from unusual alloys and contained impurities. These imperfections could have caused optical distortions, making reflections appear warped or flickering in candlelight. While this explanation is mundane, it provides a chilling insight. The mirrors themselves may have literally distorted the reality perceived by the royal family, reinforcing paranoia and superstition. Conspiracy theorists take these findings further, suggesting deliberate tampering. Could a rival power have introduced flawed mirrors to destabilize the dynasty? Were certain mirrors intentionally cracked or polished in ways that produced hallucinations? While there is no direct evidence, the pattern of destruction, mirrors in specific chambers destroyed first, raises questions. The Eastern Gallery, where the first mirror shattered, was known to host private meetings and strategic discussions. Some theorists suggest that the destruction may have been premeditated, either by internal actors within the family or by external saboteurs, to achieve a hidden objective. The debate continues in academic circles. Psychologists emphasize the plausibility of mass hysteria within the confined environment of the palace, while historians weigh the political pressures, social isolation, and family dynamics that could explain the events. Folklorists focus on the narratives passed down through generations, arguing that stories of curses and supernatural retribution often encode real historical traumas. Each perspective adds a layer of complexity, creating a multifaceted understanding of the night and its aftermath. Eyewitness accounts, though scarce, provide additional intrigue. Servants and minor courtiers described hearing voices from mirrors, seeing reflections that moved independently, or glimpsing figures not present in the room. While modern psychology might explain these phenomena as hallucinations triggered by stress and fear, the accounts are consistent enough to suggest a shared experience. Whether these were supernatural manifestations or psychological projections, they amplified the family's terror and contributed to the chaotic smashing of the mirrors. Even today, the palace attracts researchers, paranormal investigators, and historians seeking to uncover more clues. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed traces of removed mirror frames and hidden compartments, while spectrographic analysis hints at ceremonial residues, possibly from rituals intended to protect or placate supernatural forces. While such findings cannot conclusively prove the existence of a curse, they underscore the intensity of the family's obsession and the meticulousness of their preparations against perceived threats. The surviving fragments, letters, and diaries converge to create a haunting mosaic. The night of shattered glass was not an isolated event but the culmination of centuries of obsession, superstition, political pressure, and psychological strain. Yet the human need to find meaning drives interpretations in every direction. Was it divine retribution, a family's psychological collapse, or a carefully orchestrated manipulation? Each theory leaves us with more questions than answers, adding to the palace's enduring mystique. And perhaps that is precisely why the story continues to captivate. The investigations reveal not only the mechanics of destruction but the fragility of power, the consequences of fear, and the human tendency to project meaning onto reflection. Scholars may debate, but the palace, even in ruin, retains an almost magnetic pull, a place where history, legend, and horror intersect. As we move forward into the subsequent sections, we will explore the hidden personal tragedies of the heirs, the secrets unearthed long after the family's decline, and the final haunting legacy of the shattered mirrors. Each new revelation adds depth to the story, each theory leaves us questioning reality, and each shard of glass, real or metaphorical, continues to reflect the echoes of a dynasty that could not survive its own reflections. The palace, for all its grandeur, had always been a keeper of secrets. Behind gilded doors and beneath polished floors lay whispers of scandal, betrayal, and hidden desires. When the mirrors were shattered, some of these secrets seemed to spill into the open, though few were prepared to confront them. Historians and investigators who have pieced together fragments of letters, diaries, and servant accounts reveal a web of intrigues that casts the dynasty in a far darker light than official records suggest. One of the most disturbing revelations came from the king's own diaries, discovered decades after the family's decline. The entries reveal a man obsessed not only with mirrors but with control over perception, loyalty, and even the emotions of those closest to him. He wrote of spies within his court, of servants whose loyalty he doubted, and of whispers he believed could be heard through the glass itself. He chronicled secret meetings where alliances were forged in shadowed corners and broken by whispered accusations. These entries portray a ruler trapped within his own palace, a man for whom paranoia was both shield and sword. The Queen's diaries, discovered in a hidden compartment behind a long-removed mirror frame, tell a different story. They detail her clandestine liaisons with influential courtiers and visiting dignitaries, and her careful manipulation of alliances within the court. She wrote with astonishing candor, describing meetings in which promises were made and broken, and pacts were forged in the name of preserving the dynasty, or perhaps advancing her own power. Her entries hint at secret rivalries between the heirs, rivalries she may have stoked to consolidate her influence. Yet amidst the intrigue, there are also fleeting moments of vulnerability, where she expresses fear not for herself, but for her children, who were being drawn into the family's obsessive and haunted world. Perhaps the most shocking revelations came from letters between the heirs themselves. One surviving correspondence describes a young prince discovering his sister in a hidden gallery, conversing with the reflection of the queen, a mirror long covered with heavy drapes. The prince, alarmed and incredulous, warned his siblings of a growing madness. Another letter reveals a daughter secretly documenting her own visions, claiming that certain mirrors speak when no one is near, and show faces that will haunt me forever. These writings suggest that obsession with reflection, secrecy, and paranoia was not limited to the adults, it had become a hereditary burden, shaping the psyche of the next generation. Servant memoirs add another layer to the palace's dark history. They speak of hidden passages and secret chambers, rooms where illicit meetings took place, and corridors used to eavesdrop on whispered conversations. One memoir recounts a clandestine encounter in a back hallway, where a trusted advisor allegedly plotted with a foreign envoy to destabilize the dynasty. Another account describes a hidden alcove where the queen would meet her confidants, discussing strategies and sometimes revenge, always under the eyes of mirrors that reflected more than appearances. The palace, in these memoirs, emerges as a labyrinth not just of stone and glass but of intrigue and manipulation, where every corner might conceal a secret or a trap. Among the most chilling discoveries were hints of violence concealed behind palace walls. Diaries and letters imply that punishments for perceived betrayal were carried out quietly, without public record. Servants speak of prisoners kept in hidden chambers, of letters and diaries mysteriously disappearing, and of injuries sustained by courtiers who angered the king or queen. Though documentation is sparse, the pattern is unmistakable. Power within the palace was enforced not only by authority and wealth but by fear and secrecy. These revelations also illuminate why the mirrors were such a potent symbol. They were not only instruments of vanity or surveillance, they were witnesses to every clandestine act, every whispered betrayal, every illicit rendezvous. When the mirrors were shattered, it was as if the palace itself had attempted to erase the evidence of these hidden truths. And yet, fragments remained, scattered across floors, preserving slivers of memory, a physical manifestation of secrets that could never be fully destroyed. Even centuries later, the palace continues to yield surprises. Researchers uncover letters detailing previously unknown liaisons, diary entries describing conspiracies that went unrecorded in official chronicles, and servants' accounts of events that were deliberately suppressed. One particularly eerie diary describes a night when the queen confronted a mirror, whispering accusations of betrayal at her own reflection. The next morning, the mirror was found shattered, and the queen's writing hints that she did it herself, yet without recalling the act fully, a possible testament to hysteria or the psychological strain she endured. The cumulative effect of these discoveries paints a portrait of a family trapped by secrecy, obsession, and fear. The mirrors, once a symbol of power, became instruments of psychological imprisonment. The hidden diaries and letters reveal a dynasty ensnared in a self-perpetuating cycle of mistrust. The more they sought to control perception, the more distorted their reality became. What began as a palace of grandeur had become a labyrinth of shadows, where every reflection threatened revelation and every secret carried the weight of catastrophe. And yet, there is a tragic beauty in these revelations. The very documents that reveal betrayal, fear, and obsession also humanize the family, allowing modern observers to understand the depth of their suffering. The king, queen, and heirs emerge not as villains or victims alone, but as individuals caught in the complex interplay of ambition, superstition, and the inescapable pressure of legacy. Every secret uncovered adds nuance, every betrayal documented deepens the tension, and every diary entry underscores the haunting truth. The palace's mirrors reflected not only images but the fractured psyche of those who dwelled within. As the fragments of history are pieced together, a pattern emerges. The palace's obsession with mirrors, the night of shattered glass, and the subsequent decline were not isolated phenomena. They were the culmination of centuries of secrecy, betrayal, and psychological strain. The royal family's attempts to control perception, maintain power, and protect themselves from both internal and external threats ultimately created a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more they sought to dominate their reflections, the more those reflections dominated them. In the end, the secrets revealed within the palace offer both horror and insight. They show the fragility of human psyche under the weight of expectation, superstition, and obsession. They illuminate the ways in which power can be both intoxicating and destructive, and how a single obsession, in this case, mirrors, can unravel an entire dynasty. And they leave modern observers with a lingering question: when every mirror was finally smashed, was it merely the culmination of fear, or the final act of a palace determined to keep its deepest secrets hidden forever? By the time the shattered mirrors had been cleared, the royal family had become shadows of their former selves. The youngest heirs, who had once wandered the halls in curiosity and play, were now trapped in a prison of fear and ritual. Every reflection, every flicker of light, carried with it a threat, a reminder of the night of shattered glass and the chaos it unleashed. The palace, stripped of its grandeur, was a stage for isolation, suspicion, and the haunting weight of legacy. The eldest surviving prince, once confident and ambitious, now moved through corridors with eyes cast downward, avoiding even the smallest reflective surface. He had witnessed his siblings' descent into obsession and fear, and the trauma of that night had left him hesitant, wary, and perpetually anxious. Diaries reveal that he would spend hours retracing the events of the catastrophic evening, attempting to understand how mirrors could command such power over a family. Each fragment, each memory, seemed to echo endlessly, a constant reminder of the fragility of human perception. The daughters, too, bore the psychological scars of their youth. One, who had once been lively and inquisitive, became withdrawn, spending days in near silence, speaking only when absolutely necessary. She was known to wander the empty galleries, sometimes whispering to herself or gesturing toward shards of glass preserved in hidden alcoves. Another daughter, previously shy and observant, developed compulsive rituals, arranging furniture and artifacts in precise patterns, refusing to step into rooms unless certain precautions were taken. For all of them, mirrors were not merely dangerous objects, they were symbols of a reality that could no longer be trusted. The queen, who had survived the night of shattered glass with her mind fraying, became the most enigmatic figure in the palace. She oscillated between moments of clarity and deep despair, her attention consumed by the well-being of her surviving children and the preservation of the family's legacy. Diaries indicate that she attempted to instill discipline and rationality, but her efforts were often undermined by her own fears. In letters to distant relatives, she wrote of visions, shadows, and reflections that seemed to move independently, a haunting testament to the mental strain she endured. Isolation was not merely psychological, it became practical. The surviving heirs withdrew almost entirely from public life. Audiences, state meetings, and ceremonies were rare, conducted under strict supervision and only in rooms where mirrors had been removed or covered. The family's seclusion created a feedback loop, distance from the court and the public amplified paranoia, while paranoia reinforced the need for isolation. Advisors and courtiers were kept at arm's length, and servants became extensions of the family's vigilance, tasked not just with domestic duties but with monitoring behavior, preventing unauthorized access, and preserving the fragile peace within the palace walls. Despite their isolation, the heirs struggled to confront the legacy of their parents and grandparents. The night of shattered glass had become a reference point for every decision, every interaction, every perceived slight. The trauma of that night was compounded by the family's obsession with secrecy. Diaries and letters reveal a recurring theme, the fear that even small errors, careless words, or unnoticed gestures could awaken the same chaos that had destroyed their childhood. They became hyper-aware of their surroundings, of the intentions of those around them, and of the shadows cast by even the faintest light. Attempts at redemption or restoration of family stability were often thwarted by lingering superstition. Some heirs consulted priests, mystics, or physicians in an effort to cleanse the palace of its psychological residue. Ceremonies were performed to appease unknown forces, protective charms were hung throughout chambers, and rituals were meticulously recorded. Yet, as with earlier generations, these measures were only partially effective. The palace itself seemed resistant to recovery, empty frames, hidden shards, and memories of violence ensured that the night of shattered glass remained ever present, a ghostly overseer of the family's attempts at normalcy. The heirs' relationships with one another were deeply affected. Trust, already fragile, was strained by fear and the burden of memory. Letters reveal a mixture of loyalty, resentment, and apprehension. Some siblings became overprotective of one another, while others withdrew entirely, fearful that even the closest family member could become a source of betrayal or danger. Every conversation, every glance, was weighed for hidden meaning. Even laughter, once spontaneous, was tempered by the fear that it might invite the attention of the unseen forces they believed haunted the palace. A particularly striking account describes the eldest prince confronting the remnants of the shattered eastern gallery. He reportedly spent hours among the shards, touching fragments of mirrors and reflecting on the family's history. According to one diary, he whispered to the fragments, attempting to reconcile the past with the present, "You were witnesses, not enemies, yet I cannot unsee what you showed." This act, part ritual, part therapy, symbolizes the heirs' ongoing struggle to come to terms with the trauma they inherited. The last generation's struggle was not solely internal. External threats, though diminished compared to the palace's earlier political climate, remained a concern. Rival nobles, opportunistic advisors, and foreign powers monitored the family's seclusion, anticipating vulnerability. The heirs' isolation, while protective, also left them politically weakened. Letters indicate attempts at negotiation, alliance building, and strategic correspondence, yet all were tempered by fear that even minor missteps could reignite chaos or draw unwanted attention to the family's fragile state. Ultimately, the palace became a monument to the lasting psychological scars of obsession and fear. Mirrors, though gone, continued to exert influence through memory, symbol, and narrative. The surviving heirs, trapped between past trauma and the expectations of legacy, exemplify the devastating consequences of a household dominated by paranoia, secrecy, and superstition. The palace's walls, corridors, and empty galleries bear silent witness to their struggles, preserving a haunting record of lives shaped as much by reflection as by reality. And yet, even in this shadowed existence, traces of resilience emerge. The heirs maintained certain traditions, documented their experiences, and sought connection, however tenuous, with the world beyond the palace. In the smallest ways, a letter to a distant relative, a carefully tended garden, a hidden journal, they attempted to assert agency, to reclaim fragments of their humanity. These acts, though modest, reflect the enduring tension between trauma and survival, a struggle that defines the last generation of the palace. The night of shattered glass did more than destroy mirrors, it shattered perceptions, narratives, and the very aura of power surrounding the dynasty. Centuries later, the palace stands not only as a ruin of stone and glass but as a repository of psychological echoes, a place where fear, superstition, and obsession continue to reverberate. Scholars, historians, and storytellers alike have pondered the enduring legacy of that night, and the shattered mirrors have become central symbols in cultural memory, representing fragility, reflection, and the hidden costs of power. In literature, the palace and its mirrors have inspired countless works. Poets and novelists depict the dynasty as haunted by reflections, with the shattered glass serving as metaphors for fractured identity, paranoia, and the inescapable weight of history. Some narratives focus on the family's psychological descent, others on supernatural possibilities, ghosts that linger in fragments, reflections that whisper secrets, and the curse that never truly ended. The imagery of mirrors, broken and gleaming in candlelight, has become a staple in dark historical storytelling, a visual shorthand for the dangers of obsession and the fragility of legacy. Folklore surrounding the palace grew alongside these literary traditions. Local villagers told stories of reflections appearing in unexpected places, of shattered shards that could still speak, and of visions of the royal family wandering empty halls. Children were warned not to mimic the family's obsessions, lest mirrors show what should remain hidden. Even travelers reported unease when passing near the palace, claiming that shadows moved unnaturally and that the wind carried whispers of the past. The legend of the shattered mirrors became part of the collective imagination, a cautionary tale of vanity, fear, and the unseen consequences of obsession. Historians also recognize the long-term impact on governance and perception of monarchy. The dynasty's decline, accelerated by the night of shattered glass and its aftermath, became a case study in how psychological factors, fear, paranoia, superstition, can influence political power. Letters, court records, and memoirs show that both internal and external actors perceived the family as unstable, creating openings for rivals and altering alliances. The shattered mirrors were not merely symbolic, they were catalysts for a historical shift, their destruction marking the beginning of irreversible decline. Psychologically, the event has fascinated modern researchers. Studies in historical psychiatry and trauma analysis suggest that the palace's environment created conditions for collective hysteria. Obsession with mirrors, isolation, and the pressure of legacy formed a perfect storm for mass psychological distress. The experiences of the heirs and surviving family members demonstrate how trauma can be inherited, shaping behaviors, perceptions, and decision-making for generations. The palace, in effect, became a laboratory of human fear, a testament to the profound influence of environment, superstition, and history on the mind. The cultural and artistic interpretations of the palace's legacy intersect with tangible historical artifacts. Shards of mirrors preserved in museums, fragments hidden in archives, and architectural remnants of the palace itself provide physical proof of the events that occurred. These artifacts, often displayed alongside accounts of the family's decline, allow visitors and scholars to engage with history in a visceral way. The jagged edges, polished surfaces, and fractured reflections serve as haunting reminders of how obsession can distort reality and destroy both objects and lives. Even cinematic interpretations draw heavily from the night of shattered glass. Filmmakers recreate the palace in dim candlelight, corridors echoing with whispered conversations, and reflections that seem to move independently. Directors emphasize the tension, claustrophobia, and psychological unraveling of the family, using mirrors both literally and symbolically to convey the fragility of identity and the inescapable weight of legacy. The shattered mirrors, as a motif, resonate with audiences because they embody universal fears, fear of reflection, fear of truth, and fear of what lies hidden within the self. Myths surrounding the family's final years amplify the palace's chilling reputation. Local legends claim that some mirrors, though destroyed, retain fragments of consciousness, that looking into a shard could reveal past transgressions or future misfortunes. Tales of ghosts wandering empty halls, whispering advice or warnings, persist in oral tradition. Scholars debate the factual accuracy of these stories, but their persistence speaks to the psychological power of the palace's legacy. The narrative of shattered mirrors has transcended history, becoming a symbol in collective memory for the dangers of obsession, secrecy, and unchecked fear. Interestingly, the legacy also influenced architecture and design in subsequent centuries. Palaces and grand estates that followed often minimized the number of mirrors in certain chambers, particularly those used for private or political deliberations. Designers, consciously or unconsciously, incorporated lessons from the dynasty's downfall, recognizing that reflective surfaces could amplify paranoia, anxiety, or even interpersonal tension. The night of shattered glass thus left a subtle yet enduring mark on material culture, shaping both physical spaces and social behaviors. Beyond architecture and art, the psychological and social impact endures. Researchers studying family dynamics, trauma inheritance, and the influence of environment on mental health frequently cite the dynasty as a case study. The shattered mirrors are emblematic not just of superstition but of how cumulative stress, secrecy, and obsession can ripple across generations. The heir's withdrawal, compulsive behaviors, and ongoing paranoia illustrate a haunting truth: trauma is not erased by time, and symbols, in this case, mirrors, can become enduring vessels of fear and memory. The palace remains, in every sense, haunted. Not only by the literal ghosts and shadows preserved in fragments of mirrors but by the collective imagination that has preserved the dynasty's story. Visitors often describe a sense of unease, as if the very air carries whispers of past fears. Researchers, historians, and storytellers continue to explore the palace, drawn by the unresolved tension between history, legend, and psychological reality. The shattered mirrors, though long removed, continue to reflect, metaphorically, the consequences of obsession, secrecy, and fear, ensuring that the story remains vivid, compelling, and timeless. And so, the haunting legacy of the shattered mirrors is both historical and psychological, symbolic and tangible. The palace stands as a monument to the fragility of human perception, the consequences of obsession, and the power of fear to shape destinies. The dynasty's story continues to captivate not merely because of the spectacle of destruction, but because it resonates with something deeply human: our fascination with reflection, our dread of hidden truths, and our relentless desire to understand the fragile line between perception and reality. As the final chapters of the palace's story unfold, it becomes clear that the night of shattered glass and the events that followed were more than a historical incident. They were a mirror of human fragility, obsession, and the inexorable passage of fear through generations. The shattered mirrors, once objects of luxury and vanity, had become witnesses to the unraveling of a dynasty, silent testaments to the psychological, social, and political forces that shaped every aspect of life within the palace. The royal family, from the king and queen to the youngest heirs, existed in a suspended reality, one where reflections were not merely passive images but active agents in their lives. They reveal to us the devastating interplay between perception and reality, showing how a single obsession can dominate thought, behavior, and ultimately, destiny. The night of shattered glass was both literal and symbolic. The destruction of mirrors mirrored the fracturing of trust, stability, and human psyche. By examining this moment in depth, we come to understand the tenuous nature of power when bound by fear and superstition. Yet, the palace's story does not end with destruction. The aftermath, the investigations, and the secret revelations provide a layered understanding of the dynasty, flawed, human, and tragically compelling. Diaries and letters preserve voices that might otherwise have been lost, giving us intimate insight into the family's inner lives. They reveal not only paranoia and obsession but also moments of tenderness, care, and attempts at redemption. These documents allow modern observers to witness the full spectrum of human emotion in extreme circumstances: fear, guilt, love, loyalty, and the desperate need for control. The haunting legacy of the shattered mirrors extends beyond the palace walls. Across centuries, the dynasty's story has permeated culture, art, literature, and folklore. Writers, filmmakers, and storytellers draw on the image of broken glass to explore the fragility of identity, the consequences of obsession, and the haunting nature of inherited trauma. Local myths continue to warn of mirrors that retain echoes of the past, of shadows that whisper, and of reflections that reveal more than they should. The palace has become a cultural touchstone, a place where history, legend, and psychology converge to create a narrative that remains compelling and relevant. Perhaps most profoundly, the story offers a meditation on human perception and the consequences of fear. The mirrors were more than physical objects, they were instruments through which the royal family experienced reality. Their destruction did not erase the impact of those reflections, it amplified it. Trauma, superstition, and obsession persisted in memory, behavior, and narrative, ensuring that the consequences of one night echoed across generations. The palace itself, though stripped of mirrors, continues to bear the weight of these echoes, a monument to the enduring power of fear and reflection. Even today, as researchers, historians, and curious visitors approach the ruins, the atmosphere is charged with the sense of unresolved tension. One can imagine the shadows of the past lingering in the empty corridors, the whispered warnings of ancestors carried on the wind, and the glint of sunlight on hidden shards that were never fully removed. The palace stands as a reminder that the past is never truly gone, it shapes perception, memory, and identity in ways that remain invisible yet powerful. The story of the shattered mirrors reminds us that obsession and fear can be inherited, transmitted, and amplified across time, long after the events themselves have ended. In reflecting on the dynasty's fate, we are forced to confront our own relationship with perception, legacy, and obsession. The palace teaches that attempts to control reality, whether through superstition, surveillance, or dominance, can backfire, creating chaos instead of order. It warns of the fragility of human understanding when faced with the unknown or the uncontrollable. And it compels us to consider how history preserves both triumph and tragedy, reminding us that the line between human achievement and human folly is often perilously thin. The cinematic journey through the palace, its shattered mirrors, and the lives of those who inhabited it allows us to experience history not as abstract fact but as living, breathing human drama. We witness the slow escalation of paranoia, the psychological unraveling of rulers and heirs, the unfolding of secrets hidden for generations, and the ultimate legacy of fear and obsession. Each fragment of glass, each diary entry, each whispered legend adds depth, suspense, and emotional resonance, culminating in a narrative that captivates and haunts long after the story ends. And so, as the echoes of shattered glass fade into memory, the palace remains. Not merely as a ruin of stone and remnants of mirrors, but as a reflection of the human condition, a reminder that what we see, what we fear, and what we fail to confront can shape the trajectory of lives, families, and history itself. The royal family's fate is a cautionary tale, timeless in its power, resonating with anyone who has ever faced obsession, fear, or the haunting weight of legacy. In the end, the story of the palace where every mirror was smashed is not just about mirrors, madness, or even a royal dynasty. It is about reflection, literal and metaphorical, and the indelible marks left on those who inhabit both palace and mind. History, like a mirror, shows us ourselves. And the palace reminds us that when mirrors are broken, the consequences are more than visible, they are psychological, cultural, and eternal.